Greetings, my scattered sisters and brothers in the Lord. Trust you know the Lord is with you wherever you find yourself scattered today, and that you know that His presence with you is more than enough for whatever you might face today. We continue on in 1 Peter chapter 2. We are at verse 18. And in this section, Peter begins to address the household relationships of a typical household in the Greco-Roman world. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Let me get to the text. So verse 18. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing. When mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in His steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in His mouth. When He was reviled, He did not revile in return. When He suffered, He did not threaten, but continued entrusting Himself to Him who judges justly. He Himself bore our sins in His body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By His wounds you have been healed. For you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Now there's a lot in there. We're not going to unpack it all today. But in this section, Peter has a word to slaves, and then to wives, and to husbands. The typical Greco-Roman household, head of the household was a man, had wife, had kids, and had servants. Now, in the Greco-Roman world, about 40% of the population had been a slave at some point. Either they were in slavery or they had been a slave. And the way that someone became a slave was, one, your people, you, were conquered, prisoner of war. And as a prisoner of war, you were then sold to someone as a slave. Second way is that you were in debt. And so to get out of debt, you basically had to sell yourself, maybe sell your family, to whoever you were in debt to be a servant to them, to be a slave to them. So you were either taken captive in war and sold as a slave, or you were trying to sell yourself, so to speak, out of debt, and so became a slave. And then the third way someone might become a slave is that you were born into it, that your parents were slaves in debt, or because of being defeated in war, taken captive as a prisoner, and so you're born into that. Now, common that slaves were paid, and so you could save up your pay and eventually buy your own freedom. And so those were considered to be freedmen, and sometimes they continued to work in the household of their master. Sometimes they would go their way. But that was a typical opportunity, and sometimes or often it even happened by age 30, that you were able to purchase your freedom. So it was seen as an investment by the masters. Sometimes they would educate their slaves and give them great responsibility, trust them with all kinds of funds. So that's kind of how it worked in that time period. And what Peter is saying is to the servants that they are to treat their masters with respect, regardless of how the masters treat them. And this is the thing, that oftentimes the masters would treat their slaves cruelly, abuse them. And Peter is saying to the slaves, no matter how your master treats you, you are to treat them with respect. And he even says that this is a grace to you, that this is a gracious thing. And I'm trying to figure out, how is that a grace? How is that a gracious thing, that being treated cruelly, you're going to go ahead and respond with respect and honor towards the very ones who are treating you cruelly and abusing you and taking advantage of you, exploiting you? Well, I think what Peter's getting at is that this is how Christ was. That Christ never reviled, Christ never responded with some type of vengeance, that Christ was gracious. And Peter is saying, be like Christ. Imitate Christ. Don't imitate your master. Imitate Christ. Don't imitate those around you who are grumbling and who are complaining and who are looking for vengeance. Imitate Christ. He's your pattern. We'll talk more about that another session. But one further thing, this is a grace to you. This is a gracious thing. I think when we're in a situation where we are called to imitate Christ, we find Christ meeting us there. And that's a gracious thing. And it's by the power of His presence and by the power of His grace in our lives that we're able to imitate Him. And even when we have a boss or someone in authority over us that is treating us poorly, corruptly, wrongly, yet we can still respond as Christ would, because Christ is with us. And that's where it becomes a gracious thing. We're growing in our relationship with Christ, and we're being made more like Christ. So wherever you find yourself scattered today, I don't know what authority might be over you. I don't know how your boss might be treating you or someone else. But don't just imitate how they're treating you. Don't just imitate the world and how the world would respond. Imitate Christ and respond as Christ would. And you will discover it is a gracious thing as you pray for grace to do this, that Christ is with you to enable you to follow in His steps, to trace His pattern. God bless. Have a great day, and respond as Christ would, always showing respect.